If you are seeking, seek us with joy, for we live in the kingdom of joy. Do not give your heart to anything else but to the love of those who are clear joy. Do not stray into the neighborhood of despair, for there are hopes. They are real. They exist. Do not go in the direction of shadow. I tell you, suns exist. Please join me in singing our opening hymn, which is number 42, Morning So Fair to See.
Please join me in the words of our unison affirmation, which can be found in your order of service. Love is the spirit of this church, and service is its law. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Good morning. Welcome to another beautiful Sunday here at First Parish in Bedford, and it is a beautiful day even if the world is letting us know that it is still very much winter. I think the more Sundays I do this, the more I start to divide the year into just two seasons. There are black sweater days and not black sweater days, and this is definitely still a black sweater day. I'm very glad to be back here physically present with you all. I'm coming off of 2 weeks here of intermittent travel and just flew in yesterday from San Francisco. And then in the course of the night last night, a whole hour mysteriously disappeared. So I'm a little on the discombobulated side, but that's all right. I'm very much looking forward to a solid stretch of time over the next few months when I'll be staying closer to home base. I'm sure I speak for John and Megan as well on that point. We welcome you all here this morning just as you are. Whatever is going well or not so well in your life right now, we celebrate the many diversities among us of age, race, class, sexual orientation, various abilities and gender identities. Whatever your religious or political beliefs, whatever your immigration status, whether you have a social security number or not, you are welcome here. We are a Unitarian Universalist congregation, which means many things. But one of the most important things it means has been summed up eloquently by our guest preacher today, Reverend Wendy Bell, in her biographical statement. She says, "We are all in the same boat, and no one deserves to be left behind." Following the service, please join us for community hour in the common room and upstairs in the Blinn room. If this is your first time with us this morning, we invite you to stop by the welcome table if you'd like to learn more about us or tell us more about you. In the back of your order of service, I call your attention to the announcement section here to highlight just one of the very many things going around here. I want to let you know that today in the sanctuary from noon to 1 p.m., the Sanctuary Task Force will be having its second open meeting about the possibility of offering physical sanctuary in our building to a person or family who's resisting a deportation order. We will be discussing the draft language of the resolution that we'll be voting on about offering sanctuary, including our guidelines for case selection. So if you have a chance to review the language of that resolution in advance, that'd be helpful, but we'll also go over it during the meeting. And you can look for folks wearing a t-shirt like this to speak to anyone who's part of the Sanctuary Task Force. Please keep in mind that we will not be voting on the resolution at this meeting. This is just to share thoughts and feedback, concerns about the resolution itself. Childcare will be provided from 11:45 to 1:15 for parents with children who would like to attend the meeting. It is now my great privilege to introduce our morning's guest minister, the Reverend Wendy Bell, who is currently serving as the interim minister at the First Parish Malden. Reverend Bell received her Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School in 1997 and was ordained jointly by the First Church in Jamaica Plain and the First Parish in Chelmsford in 2000. She served as the interim minister of the First UU Society of Rockport before being called to the Harvard UU Church in Harvard, Massachusetts, where she had a flourishing ministry over the next 14 years. Wendy is also currently a doctoral student at Andover Newton Theological School, where her work is focused on the liberal religious response to climate change. In her free time, Wendy loves to read, hike, kayak, and she is also learning to play the bagpipes, which means she will find some kindred spirits in this church. She lives in Arlington with her wife, Kathy, and their daughter. The service today is devoted to the theme of joy as a form of resistance, which I think is very fitting because I think my last sermon here was sort of making a pitch for sadness as a form of resistance. So this will complement that theme very well and carry it to a bit more of a high note. Nothing could be more crucial for the work ahead than that we find more and newer ways to sustain ourselves in resisting the tendencies in this world that try to make us forget that great truth of universalism, that there is room enough for all of us in the boat. With much gratitude for her sharing her ministry with us this morning, I now turn things over to Wendy for a time for all ages.
Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here this morning, to be with you and to have this opportunity to share a time for all ages with you. It's a very special day today for some of our neighbors and friends and family members, for it is the Jewish holiday of Purim. This is one of the most joyful holidays in the entire Jewish liturgical year, and every year on this day, observant Jews gather together to hear a story, the story of Esther, the story of this young Jewish woman who became a queen and then later saved the Jewish people from destruction. And so this morning, in honor of Purim, I'd like to share with you a shortened version of the story. Before I begin, I want to introduce the four main characters that I'm going to be talking about today. The first is the king, who is a very powerful, very important man, and he loves Esther very much when she becomes his queen. And then there is a man named Mordecai, who is a Jewish man who is Esther's uncle. He raised Esther as if she were his daughter and loves her very much as well. And next there is Haman, who is the king's top advisor. And he is the villain in our story, a very rich man with no principles or scruples. And finally, there is Esther, our heroine, a young Jewish woman who, as I said, becomes the queen. Now, to tell the story the way it is meant to be told, I'm going to need some help from you. I don't know how many of you have done this before or heard the story read in this tradition, but I have to give all of you, whether you're young or old or anywhere in between, two jobs to help me. The first is this. Whenever you hear me say the name of Haman, the villain, I need you to help me by booing and hissing and stomping your feet to blot out his ugly name. Can you practice? Haman. This is going to be great. All right. The second task that you have before you today is every time I say the name Esther, you're going to cheer like you've never cheered before. She is your hero, okay? So let's practice that too. Esther. All right, this is going to be good. Okay, let's tell the story together then. This is how it starts. One day, the king held a great feast to celebrate his powerful kingdom. He had invited all of the people in the city, but Mordecai, who was a wise man and the leader of the Jews, warned his people, the Jewish people, not to go to the feast because he didn't trust the king. He didn't think that the king liked the Jewish people very much. At the end of the feast, the king announced that he would be looking for a new wife to be his queen. That night, Mordecai went to his niece, the young woman, whose name was Hadassah in Hebrew, but in Persian, it was Esther. And he told her that the king was looking for a new queen and that she was so beautiful that surely the king would choose her. And sure enough, because Esther was kind and gentle and very beautiful, the king chose her as his new queen as soon as he saw her. Before she left her uncle's home, Mordecai said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go to the king's palace, but don't tell anyone you're Jewish, because surely that will make the king unhappy." She went to the palace, and every day Mordecai sat outside of the palace gate to wait for news from Esther. One day, as he was sitting by the palace gate, Mordecai happened to hear two men plotting to kill the king. He warned Esther, who notified the king and saved his life. And the two men were caught and they were taken away. Although this great deed of Mordecai's was recorded in the royal book, that he had saved the king, the matter was then forgotten once the book was closed. Now, soon after Mordecai saved the king's life and was forgotten, the king appointed the richest man in the kingdom to be his new prime minister, Haman. All the king's subjects were ordered to honor Haman and to bow down before him. Everyone did except for Mordecai, for the prime minister wore a large medallion around his neck, and it had a picture of an idol. And Mordecai didn't want people to think that he was bowing down before an idol because that was not okay. Jews were forbidden to worship or honor idols. You know what? Haman was furious that Mordecai would not bow to him, and he went straight to the king to complain. He said, "King, there's one nation scattered throughout your kingdom which is different from all the other nations. They don't eat our food or drink our wine or marry our daughters. They don't keep the king's laws, and they don't work every seventh day. They rest, and they are always celebrating their holidays. If you give me permission, I will destroy these people, the Jews." The king, sort of an oblivious guy, though a nice guy, gave permission. And so Haman sent out letters sealed with the king's royal ring to each of the provinces in the kingdom. And the letters said this: on the 13th day of the month of Adar, you are to destroy, kill, slaughter all the Jewish people, young and old, women and children, all in one day, and their money and their property will belong to you. Now, when Mordecai heard this, he said to the queen, "This decree is terrible news. I fear for our people. You must go to the king and try to save the Jews." Poor Esther. She was afraid, for it was forbidden for her to speak to the king unless he spoke to her first. But Mordecai encouraged her by saying, "You know, it could be that you were made queen for this very purpose." Esther was afraid. But she had a plan. She went to the king and he asked her, "What is your request, my queen? Half of my kingdom is yours for the taking if you wish it." And Esther replied by saying that she wanted to invite the king and his advisor to a banquet the next night. And this made the king and Haman very happy. But later that night, Haman saw Mordecai at the palace gates, and he was filled again with hatred, and he wanted to kill Mordecai right then and there without waiting until the 13th of Adar. That night, the king could not fall asleep. He tossed and he turned, and finally his servant came to him and brought him the royal book to read him a story, basically, to read him a bedtime story to get him to go to sleep. And that big, heavy royal book fell open to the story about how Mordecai the Jew had warned him of the plot against the king and had saved the king's life. And hearing that story again before he went to bed, the king asked, "What reward did this wonderful man Mordecai receive?" And the servant who was reading the story said, "None. None is recorded." Well, just then, someone burst in. It was Haman, coming to ask permission of the king to hang Mordecai the Jew. He was in such a hurry, he couldn't even wait for the morning. But before he had a chance to ask the king asked him a question. "Haman, tell me, what shall be done for a man that the king wishes to honor?" And Haman was so gleeful to hear that question because, of course, he thought the king was talking about him. "I know just the thing," said Haman. "Let that man wear the royal robes of the king. Place that man on the king's royal horses. Put the royal king's crown upon his head and lead him through the streets with a servant crying out, 'Thus shall be done to the man whom the king wishes to honor.'" "That's a wonderful idea," said the king. "I shall leave it to you. Go find Mordecai the Jew and do exactly as you described, down to the very last detail." And Haman did as he was commanded. And Mordecai was led with royal honor through the city streets. Now Haman, as you can imagine, returned to the palace that night a bitter, broken man. He had been absolutely humiliated. But he had no time to brood because now it was time to go to Esther's banquet. Once there, he heard the king ask his queen again, "What is it you desire, Esther? Just speak and it shall be done for you." And she replied, "Spare my life and the lives of my people, for we have been sentenced to death." And the king was totally surprised. "Death? Your people? What? By whom?" And Esther replied, "Oh, come on." Esther replied, "By an evil and wicked man, by your prime minister, Haman." And the king was very angry. "What plan have you tried to sneak under my nose? That shall not be. Take him away. And Haman was led away. And in the end, Mordecai became the new prime minister to the king, and the Jewish people were saved because of one brave act of resistance by Queen Esther. Thank you for helping me tell the story this morning, and now I believe it's time for the children and the RE leaders to go to the common room for ingathering. And we will stay here, the rest of us, and sing together our next hymn, number 108, My Life Flows On in Endless Song.
Maureen Oates will be sharing a stewardship moment.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. Hey. I am Maureen Oates, and I've been one of the many faces around here for some 20 years, ever since my grandchild, Adrian Ballou, got old enough to sing in the kiddie choir. So, a little child said, "Lead them," and that's how I got here. I found a congregation involved in a myriad of good works, creative and enthusiastic people dedicated to improving the world around them and the people in it. Whatever one's passion, there's a committee, a force group, a task force, a project, or whatever to sustain it. My own passion is environmental education, primarily for children and youth. Lisa Rubin and I agreed on its importance, and we set out to create Earth Circles, an environmental justice curriculum for 4th through 6th grades. Earth Circles is designed to teach caring and responsibility for the home of all living things on planet Earth, science for understanding, and spirituality for caring. We have 6 units: Water at Work, which is about water supply and issues around it in our country, developing countries everywhere. Visiting Nature, guidelines for outdoor learning to develop feelings of connection with the natural world. Soils and seeds, mixing soils and flowers, and growing flowers in the classroom, and the fruitful garden for growing food plants outdoors. Acquiring energy, which is about sources of energy and how we use it here and in developing countries as well. Climate change, how heat, carbon dioxide, and climate are related. Now, those last two are still in process, but they'll be finished very soon. There are copies of the different units and more information on a table in the common room. Here's one place where pledges matter, and volunteer support as well. As an example, the Social Responsibility Council twice provided a financial boost when we needed it. The UU Sunday School Society also gave us a very helpful grant. And the personal volunteer support, everything from trial teaching lesson plans to editing text to layout and design of materials, has been abundant and invaluable. And yes, for the spring, religious education is using these materials for climate change lessons for all ages. A remarkable adaptation by Janet Powers, whose constant collaboration was and is invaluable. Here is a volunteer opportunity to assist with teaching this program starting next Sunday, and we need volunteers, so put your name and contact information on the sign-up sheet in the common room. I like this quote, often attributed to Longfellow, but actually the work of a contemporary woman poet, Julia Fletcher Kearney. And I won't say any more about women's issues. The quote, "Little drops of water, little grains of sand, make the mighty ocean and the beauteous land. Whether your pledge is a few drops or a whole cupful or more, it is important. Every drop counts. Each pledge is a necessary part of support for this mighty ocean of a place. I know you will do your best. Thank you."
What a wonderful message. The reading this morning that I've selected is one of my favorite poems by one of my favorite poets, "Don't Hesitate" by Mary Oliver. If you suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, don't hesitate. Give in to it. There are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be. We are not wise and not very often kind, and much can never be redeemed. Still, life has some possibility left. Perhaps this is its way of fighting back, that sometimes something happens better than all of the riches or power in the world. It could be anything, but very likely you notice it in the instant when love begins. Anyway, that's often the case. Anyway, whatever it is, don't be afraid of its plenty. Joy is not made to be a crumb.
Freely we have received, freely let us give to support the good work of this congregation here and far, far beyond these walls. The offering will now be gratefully received.
I've been thinking a lot about the story of Esther that we told together this morning in these last few weeks as I've been preparing to be with you this morning, and I've been thinking too about the holiday of Purim itself. There are, for those of you who are not really familiar with the holiday, 4 commandments associated with Purim. The first is to tell the story each year, very much like the way we told it this morning. The second is to celebrate, to hold a joyous feast, to eat and drink and be merry. The third, lesser well-known perhaps to many of us, is to send out gifts of food and drink to family and friends. And the fourth and final one is to give generously to the poor. And we're going to get back to those last 2, but I've been thinking mostly about the first 2, initially anyway. I've been thinking about this juxtaposition of terror and joy in this holiday, of the threat of annihilation on the one hand and the requirement of celebration on the other. On the one hand, the commandment to be joyful makes all the sense in the world, for it is in response to this extraordinary and surprising victory, the overcoming of immense adversity. And on the other hand, this commandment to perpetually retell the story year after year serves to remind us perennially of the fragility and the unpredictability of life. It is a reminder of the possibility that our lives can change dramatically as a result of the impetuous decisions of someone in power who might have a personal agenda or a bruised ego or a grudge. It is said in the book of Esther that when the Jewish people learned that they were to be killed, they were thrown into confusion, which I take to mean the disorientation of disbelief. Is this really happening? They must have wondered. Could this possibly be happening again? And then throughout the kingdom there was a great mourning, weeping, lamenting. They wore sackcloth and covered themselves with ashes. It's an understandable reaction to the news that your lives and the lives of those whom you love are in danger, and to the realization that there may be nothing that you can do in the face of immense power wielded by those who despise and detest you and all for which you stand. People who want to systematically dismantle the foundation upon which you have built your life and your children's lives, and who even want to rob you of life itself. We cannot hear this story today without remembering that this was neither the first nor the last time that the Jewish people were threatened with annihilation. And we cannot hear the story told today without remembering that there have been over 130 bomb threats made toward Jewish community centers, including some here in Massachusetts, since the beginning of the year, and that Jewish cemeteries have been desecrated. Rabbi Sharon Brous has referred to Purim as our annual journey to the edge of the cliff. Our annual journey to the edge of the cliff. Purim is a yearly reminder that for the Jewish people, life has been historically precarious. And it is a reminder to all of us that we too live in a world where people with great power can do terrible harm, where there are plenty of lives and whole towns destroyed or about to be, as Mary Oliver says. The question is, how do we live in such a world? How do we live in a world where this is so? Mary Oliver says, if we suddenly and unexpectedly feel joy, we should not hesitate, we should give into it, and I think that is wonderful advice. But hers is a poem about grace, about joy arriving unexpectedly, about giving in to it when it arrives. Purim is, in a sense, about being joyful, although you have considered all the facts, as Wendell Berry says. Purim is about joy as an act of intentionality, about teaching us that joy is not just a gift that arrives out of the blue, but that it can also be cultivated, and that the experience of joy itself can be a form of resistance. I want to talk this morning with you a little bit about joy as resistance, but before we go there, I want to find out where we are, and I want to start there. So I'm going to ask you to reflect for a minute. When you think about what is going on in your world today, and you might define your world for these purposes very broadly or very narrowly, what is it that you have been feeling? What is on your heart as you come to this place, to this community here today? In the description of this morning's service, I invited you to come as you are, to bring your fear, your anger, your sadness, as well as your disdain for injustice. I chose those three feelings, fear and anger and sadness, for a reason. For according to scientists, as I understand it, scientists who study the brain, fear and anger and sadness are three of what they think are the four fundamental emotions. And the fourth is joy. And all four are somehow wired into our brains. So presumably there is some reason for that. There's some survival value to each of these four emotions. I want to look at that a little bit. The evolutionary value of fear and anger might be fairly apparent. Fear is the emotion that is connected to the instinct to flee, and anger is the emotion that is tied to the instinct to fight. And both of those have tremendous survival value in the short term. They get us out of a lot of bad pickles. But they are not so healthy, as we know, over the long term. Continuous exposure to stress hormones is not a good thing, as we know, and they can wreak havoc on our bodies and our minds. Both fear and anger, it's also, I think, important to point out, are by their nature very self-focused. And as the Dalai Lama has said in a relatively new book that's out, the Book of Joy, thinking of me automatically brings fear, a sense of insecurity and distrust. That kind of person, he says, will never be happy. Or perhaps, as it turns out, that person may also not only not be happy, but may not be optimally healthy. One researcher, Larry Sherwitz, found that people who more frequently said the words I, me, or mine had a higher risk of having a heart attack and a higher risk of their heart attack being fatal. Sherwitz found that this so-called self-involvement was actually a better predictor of death than smoking, high cholesterol levels, or high blood pressure. If you find yourselves living in an extended state of either fear or anger or some combination of those two, I want to tell you that my heart goes out to you. That's something with which I, too, sometimes struggle in this world today. And we are not alone. We come to church to remember that we are not alone. There are a lot of us living in fear and feeling anger and angst. There are children I know who are afraid that their friends will be deported or that one or both of their parents will be snatched away. I had coffee with a gentleman this week who is in his early 60s and living with chronic illness and on disability, and he is afraid, understandably so, that imminent changes to health care and housing policy may result in his homelessness or even his untimely death. And as serious as that possibility may be, the unfortunate irony is that our own fear and anger could do as much damage to our health in the long term as those seemingly shorter-term threats we fear. The bottom line is, because I don't want to linger here with fear and anger, the bottom line is we can't live this way. We cannot live in a perpetual state of fear or anger. And so the question is, how do we get out of it? One temptation to avoid those uncomfortable feelings is to simply numb ourselves to the pain, but we know that's not healthy either. In the Book of Joy, the Dalai Lama says that what we really want is to feel joy, right? That's what everybody wants, and that's what he would say is the purpose of our lives, to find joy and to avoid suffering. That's what we all want. But how do we get there? And that brings us to the third fundamental emotion, sadness, and the role that sadness might play. And I haven't read Josh's sermon. I'm sure it was wonderful, and this may or may not be review for some of you who are here. I won't talk about sadness long either, but sadness is an interesting emotion. Sadness means at some level that we are in the process of accepting what is and letting ourselves feel the grief that comes with seeing what is, and the loss of both what was and what never may now be. Sadness requires our being present in the moment. And the ability to be present in each moment is nothing more and nothing less than the ability to accept the vulnerability and discomfort and anxiety of everyday life. Sadness is uncomfortable. And so when we're faced with it, we're often tempted to flee or to fight, to live in a state of fear or anger again in order to avoid the sadness. I had this mental image when I was working on this sermon of a kind of pinball machine in which our emotions are ricocheting around between anger and fear, and gravity somehow keeps pulling them back to this seeming abyss, which is sadness, as we frantically try to avoid that by hitting those buttons that move those flippers that send the little ball bouncing back toward fear and anger, and around we go. Sadness can be frightening. It can overwhelm us and threaten us, and yet it is supposedly one of those four fundamental emotions, as I said. And so, what is the evolutionary value of sadness? It turns out, this was news to me, that in fact mild periodic sadness actually does have some benefits. Psychology researcher Joseph Fargus found that people who were experiencing sadness had better judgment and memory, were more motivated, more sensitive to social norms, and more generous than the happier control group. And what was particularly interesting is that brief sadness might generate more empathy, more generosity. Participants in this particular study played a game, part of which was involving deciding how much money to give themselves and to give others. And it turns out that the sad participants gave significantly more to other participants than the happy ones. The conclusion was that while depression certainly can collapse our circle of concern inward, the periodic feeling of sadness might actually widen our circle of concern outward. Perhaps then the evolutionary value of sadness is that it has the potential to help us let go of our self-absorption, the me of fear and anger, and develop genuine care and empathy for others, or at least the very realization that we are not alone, that others suffer too. There is that famous story that some of you may have heard from the Buddhist tradition about the woman who lost her child and was inconsolable in her grief, carrying her dead child around with her, begging for someone to help her heal her child. And when she came to the Buddha, she begged him to help her. And he told her he could help her if she would go and collect mustard seeds for the medicine. And she eagerly agreed. And then the Buddha explained that the mustard seeds for the medicine needed to come from a house that had never been touched by death. Well, when the woman visited each house in search of the mustard seeds that might heal her son, she discovered that there was no house that had not suffered the loss of a parent or a spouse or a child. And seeing that her suffering was not unique, she had her mind and heart expanded and was able to experience her sadness, let go of her child, and release her grief. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, also as part of this book of joy written with the Dalai Lama, has said, "You will be surprised by the joy the minute you stop being too self-regarding. And the poet David White says that joy is a meeting place of deep intentionality and of self-forgetting, the bodily alchemy of what lies inside us in communion with what formerly seemed outside. The sheer, intoxicating beauty of the world inhabited as an edge between what we previously thought was us and what we thought was other than us. And then there is this rabbinic commentary which reads, "There is no greater or more powerful joy than to bring joy to the heart of a poor person, an orphan, or a widow." That is how we become godlike. Which brings us back to those third and fourth commandments that are part of the Purim celebration, the requirement to bring food and drink to our friends and family, and the requirement to give generously to the poor. Perhaps a fair, brief paraphrase of the Purim commandments might be this. First, relive the pain and feel the sadness of the reality of life's precariousness. Sit with it a while. Accept it as reality. Second, from that place of acceptance, learn to cultivate joy. Third, joy can be found in connecting with those you love. And fourth, great joy can be found in being compassionate and generous toward those who are in need. Do this to resist the powers of death and despair. In the book of Deuteronomy, God says, "I have set before you life and death. Choose life." Well, it turns out that the practice of generosity is actually associated with better health and longer life expectancy. Apparently, just thinking about being generous, just thinking about it, not even doing it, significantly increases the protective antibody salivary immunoglobulin A. Don't make me say that again. A protein that is used by the immune system to keep us healthy. And so it seems, and this is a timely message for you who are in the midst of a stewardship campaign, that money can buy happiness as long as you spend it on other people. And here's the other good news for those of us who do church work. Volunteering reduces the risk of death by 24%. It pays to be generous. So it really does appear that there's some survival value here to joy, that joy is life-giving. Here's another factoid. The same reward centers of the brain seem to light up when we are doing something compassionate, as do when we think of chocolate. Just think of chocolate. Your brain is lighting up. The warm feeling that we get from helping others comes from the release of oxytocin, which seems to have health benefits, including the reduction of inflammation in the cardiovascular system. And so, my friends, it appears to be true that compassion can literally make your heart healthy and happy. To choose life is to choose concern for others. To choose life means to choose compassion and gratitude and generosity, to choose inclusion and humility and humor, to choose acceptance and forgiveness. And the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu will tell you that joy is a byproduct of all of those things, all of these life-giving qualities of mind and heart. Make no mistake, the forces of greed and exclusion, of hatred and delusion, of isolation and seclusion that are part of our world today, these are forces of death. Joy is a form of resistance because it asks of us and requires of us precisely the opposite of what our current dominant culture demands. When our culture tells us to turn away from other people in fear or in anger, it becomes an act of resistance to turn toward people in compassion. When our leaders tell us to exclude others, it becomes an act of resistance to include them. When our leaders and our culture both shout, me, mine, 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 it becomes an act of resistance to shout we and us and ours. And because joy is rooted in those very things, those very practices of compassion and inclusion and we and us and ours, the cultivation and experience of joy itself becomes an act of resistance. Joseph Campbell once said that a hero or a heroine is someone who has given their life to something bigger than oneself. I believe that we are called to be heroes, part of a great and growing resistance movement, peopled by those who strive to grow beyond our fear and anger and anxious self-absorption, those who turn ourselves outward toward one another, those who live by passion and compassion, those who celebrate life in the face of death, those who sing and laugh and dance, and who dare to declare day after day, be joyful though you have considered all the facts. So give in to joy, but don't wait for it. Seek it out. Embrace it and embody it through acts of big-hearted compassion and unreasonably extravagant generosity toward others. Feast on it, relish it, savor it, for joy is not meant to be a crumb. So may it be in our hearts. I'd like to invite you now to join me in singing our closing hymn this morning, which is number 29 in the hymnal, Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. It is a strange thing to be so bound and so released all in the same moment, to feel the heart wide open and wider still even as it turns to take its leave. On this day, let us say this is simply the way love moves, in its ceaseless spiraling, turning us toward one another and then sending us into what waits for us, with open arms wide to us, in welcome and in hope. On this day, in this place where you have poured yourself out, where you have been emptied and filled and emptied again, may you be aware more than ever of what your heart has opened to hear, what it has tended and welcomed here, where it has broken in love and in grief, where it has given and received blessing in the unfathomable mystery that moves us and undoes us and remakes us finally for joy. This day, may you know this joy in full measure. This day, may you know this blessing that gathers you in and sends you forth but will not forget you. Oh, hear us as this day we say grace, this day we say grateful, this day we say blessing, this day we release you in God's keeping and hold you in gladness and in love. Amen.